So, Majbin, can you just revise with us the time?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we will have 40 minutes for presentation, then 20 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah. 40 minutes for presentation, 20 minutes for Q&A, right? Sounds good.
People started joining.
Yeah.
So I think we can start now.
Yeah, we can start as people come in. Okay.
Yeah, hello everyone. Today is our TAFSSA's 7th webinar. We have Gazdar from Pakistan to talk about agricultural growth, hunger and poverty in Pakistan, a historical perspective on the agri-food systems of Indus Plains. So I would like to request Dr. Shreya Chakraborty to introduce Haris. She knows her very well, so she can introduce her very well. So after that, we will have the presentation from Haris. So over to you, Shreya.
Thank you, Majbin. Okay, I would like to welcome Haris with this introduction. So Mr. Haris Gazdar is a director and senior researcher at the Collective for Social Science Research, which is an independent academic policy research organization in Karachi, Pakistan. He has contributed widely as a social scientist to research and policy debates in Pakistan and has conducted academic research in UK, India, and Pakistan. His recent research on women agriculture workers has influenced legislative and policy action in Pakistan. So he currently serves as the coordinator on social protection to the Chief Minister of the Sindh province of Pakistan. So we have a lot of experience with Haris here. So under the TAFSSA initiative, Haris has been collaborating with us to jointly look through a historical lens at the agri-food systems in Pakistan, which we feel in the initiative provides a very critical and crucial structural policy scaffolding to our systems research in the initiative. For this, we have made him dig through months and months and loads of maps and dusty old books. And this is the research that Haris will present today. This will be the first in a series of 3 historical review study webinars that we will have. All right, over to you, Haris. Welcome and thanks. We'll do this for 40 minutes and then we'll open it up for question answers. Please put your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mahjabeen, and thank you very much, Shreya, for the kind introduction. I'm sorry, I should have informed you that I'm no longer the coordinator for the CM, so that job is done. So I'm back to dusty books and maps.
Congratulations then on that role.
Thank you. Now, I want to basically talk about this study that we've been working on. And let me just make sure that I'm sharing a presentation. Can you see the presentation?
You are. We can see it, but we are not able to see the presentation mode. Yeah, we can now see the presentation mode.
Okay, so this study actually, and it's a very ambitious study, and I'm not sure if I will be able to do much justice to it in the time that we have, but I'll just try and give you a gist of what we're doing. And it's about agri-food systems and looking at them from a historical point of view and identifying important turning points and then tracing back some of the important institutional, organizational, and technological changes and technological conditions that we are living with now. And a lot of the issues that we're facing now in terms of current policy discussions and debates and policy conundrums really with respect to history. And this has been a very fruitful exercise because I think that we have identified a number of important blind spots just by looking at a historical perspective. So setting up the problem and how I began to look at this problem and began to set it up was firstly one conundrum, which was that Pakistan has relatively good agricultural endowments and historically has had. has good resources with respect to land and irrigation. A lot of those resources are coming are being exhausted now, but nevertheless, a concern that there is persistent hunger and undernutrition, and also slow progress with respect to food security and undernutrition, dietary diversity and anthropometrics. So all of that happening while the country is mostly self-sufficient in food, and also is an exporter of agricultural produce in some markets in a significant way. Now, in general, there is so if you look at this from the point of view of agriculture, so a lot of the work on agriculture seems to be disassociated from the outcomes with respect to hunger and rural poverty, but nevertheless, what are they saying? So the narrative of agriculture in Pakistan recently, over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, is that of underperformance. And I've put that in inverted commas. So that's a general view. But this underperformance is usually discussed with respect to two kinds of variables. One is that the growth rate in agriculture is slow in the last 2 decades compared with the preceding decades. And also, people like to compare yields of important crops with other countries. Now neither of these are actually very good ways of understanding underperformance, or not the only ways. So if you look at productivity growth, and if you look at it competitiveness, it's not clear that agriculture underperforms. So it might still be underperforming, but it's not immediately clear. I will tell you a little bit more about that. The other important problem is that there is very little attention in policy and in academia in Pakistan between linkages on linkages between agricultural growth and the reduction of hunger and rural poverty. So that you can see obviously is a big problem, because if we're interested in hunger and undernutrition, and agriculture has to contribute to those goals, then we must have a clear view about how agriculture is connected to that. And because we don't have very explicit discussions on that, so what we end up doing is making those linkages in a casual kind of lazy way, that agricultural growth will automatically lead to reductions in hunger and poverty. And I'm going to show you, using the regional perspective, that how this might be not a very good way of thinking about issues. And finally, there are political and policy spaces now, which are, I believe, as yet unutilized. And I hope that through this study and studies like this, we can start utilizing some of those spaces. So that's a problem. How we are going to look at this problem is we will deploy a historical perspective on agricultural subregions. Now, agricultural subregions are important because I think that we are all interested in agri-food systems, and those food systems exist not at the national level, but they exist in more compact regional economies around agroclimatic conditions, infrastructure, land systems, even class and social structures and markets. All of these things are very specific to location, and the more granular you can become, the better. But nevertheless, it is important to get to sub-regions. In the case of Pakistan, I'll tell you a bit more that some of those regions are administrative ones, and then perhaps we can go below them a little bit. And then we need a historical perspective on agri-food systems, because these 3 or 4 variables that I talk about, infrastructure, land systems, class and social structures and markets, all of these things which shape agri-food systems, they're themselves shaped by historical turning points. And, the study of history can be complicated. We're not talking about causality, but we're talking about trends, and we're talking about, correlations and associations. But nevertheless, what we want to get out of it is that by observing historical trends, we want to see what is of long standing and what can change, and how have things changed in the past. So the main sources of material for historical work is our colonial land settlement debates and documentation. And that in some ways constrains us also, because it forces us to look at the time period when the kind of documentation that we're used to analyzing is available. There are studies on irrigation development, and there are historical studies on key milestones. I'll tell you a little bit more about those. Let me just introduce the country first quickly, and the provinces, since I've already introduced the importance of sub-regions or regions. So the main Pakistan is a federal state with 4 provinces. There are other regions also, but I will stick with provinces because that's where a lot of the policy work happens. And here are some very kind of basic statistics on population and land. The important thing to note is that there is a very big variation between the western provinces, Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and the eastern ones, Punjab and Sindh, which are mostly the irrigated plains in terms of population as well as in terms of land and cultivated area. This is what the country looks like, and the rivers are very important. And of course, you see this area, this is mostly kind of mountainous or sub-mountain, and these are your floodplain. This is what I will end up talking about. But I've kept this on because in the broader study, there is some comparative discussion about those. But the rivers and irrigation systems will define much of what we say in this talk. And these are agroecological zones. These were, I think, done by FAO with and historically have been validated by Pakistani researchers. And the important thing is this. So this is Punjab. This province is Punjab, and this is Sindh. And so this light green or green is, and this green, these are basically your irrigated plains in the Punjab and in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa region. And then these are irrigated plains in Sindh. So this is basically your agricultural heartland. Now, another sub-region that I want to talk about, which is basically South Punjab and the rest of Punjab. So this region, it is not a province. It has some administrative significance now. It certainly has political significance, but as I will argue, it also has historical significance with respect to the development of agri-food systems. So from that point of view also, it's a significant region that I want to talk about. And a lot of the numbers I will give are actually about the South Punjab and the rest of Punjab in comparison with the other regions. This is another picture of the Canal Command area, just to give you a sense that we will talk mostly about canal irrigated agriculture. And you can see that much of it is in South Punjab, the rest of Punjab and Sindh. There are pockets in both Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan, but most of it is in these two big provinces. And here are some of the numbers. So if you look at the proportion of cultivated area which was irrigated, so for Pakistan as a whole, about 80%, in Sindh, 94%, Punjab, 83%. And canal irrigation, obviously very important, both in Sindh and Punjab. In Sindh, 80% of the irrigated area was only irrigated by canals. And or 80% of, I think, cultivated area was only irrigated by canals. So it's a complete dependence on canals or surface irrigation. In Punjab, it's a mix of canals and tube wells. And here are some, I'm going to run through some of these statistics and then basically go into the main argument, which is basically around history. But these I do want to mention here. So if you look at output and regional shares of major crops, like wheat, rice, cotton, and sugarcane, then you can see again that Punjab and Sindh dominate. So basically, if you're looking at agri-food systems, then looking at these two provinces and regions within them, they tell us a story. And then if you look at the yield of major crops, this is important. In the last 5 years, I've taken averages. So this is tons per hectare, I think. So again, you see that yields are relatively higher in these regions, South Punjab, rest of Punjab, and Sindh. And also important to note, and this thing that it will come up again later, is that yields are high in South Punjab and Sindh, both for wheat and for cotton and for sugarcane. So, so these important crops, these two regions, and I'm going to talk more about these regions as we go, and I'll tell you why. Now, this is an important slide. I've highlighted in green the regions I want to draw your attention to. And here is this slide, and I can make many more slides like this, and I can do a lot more analysis like this, but this in a nutshell captures what I want to discuss. And what I want to discuss is this, that basically I want to look at these figures, which is basically food insecurity measured using the food insecurity experience scale. It's a representative national sample. It's representative at the sub-regional level. So if you look at Pakistan as a whole, so around 1/6 of the population was food insecure using that scale, moderate to severe food insecurity. But just look at the regional variations. Balochistan, 23%, and South Punjab, 21%, but the rest of Punjab, 13%. So the huge contrast within Punjab. And then look at Sindh, which is 22%. If you can look at poverty headcount ratios, again, a big contrast between the regions of Punjab. And South Punjab and Sindh look similar, also look similar to Balochistan, which is very poor. But then look at, per capita production of food grains. So now just remember that these are regions which are quite poor and also relatively hungry. And they have relatively high output per capita of food grains. So, so this is basically just one way of saying that the relationship between agricultural performance and the reduction in hunger and food insecurity and rural poverty is not automatic, at least if you look at it from a regional point of view. If you look at it from the household point of view, also it isn't. But the regions are important, and these are big regions which account for a big amount of agricultural output and agricultural growth. And they also account for, at least South Punjab and Sindh, account for a big part of rural poverty and rural hunger. Now, part of that disconnect, it comes from access to land. Now, if you look at landlessness, again, these regions are telling you different stories. And so Punjab as a whole, about 50% of rural households own land, and in Sindh, 24%. So a big amount of it is landlessness, and also, tenancy and so on. So, so part of it is to do, and then if you look at land inequality, again, Sindh and South Punjab, the proportion of land owned in holdings exceeding 100 acres, 12% in South Punjab and 15% in Sindh. So high levels of land inequality. And this is, I'm going to talk about the historical antecedents of that too. So the outline of the main argument, the disconnect between agricultural performance and hunger and rural poverty. So while there are significant pockets of, why are there significant pockets of hunger and rural poverty in well-performing agricultural regions? So that's an important factoid which I've already given you, and we can deepen this in many, many different ways. But given that there is very little analysis in Pakistan so far of the disconnect between agricultural performance and hunger and rural poverty, we've already made a start there. And we've come up with this conundrum that there are significant pockets of hunger and rural poverty in well-performing agricultural regions. Now, if that factoid stands, then already there should be alarm bells ringing about the easy or lazy story of an automatic connection between agricultural growth on the one hand and the reduction in hunger and poverty on the other. There's another layer to the argument, which is actually kind of even more serious, which is I'm asking the question. In this question, I will try to substantiate using my historical material that is it possible that agricultural performance is based in part on rural poverty? Okay, it's a bit radical. So actually the more kind of nuanced and correct way of saying it is, are they both driven by factors which are underlinked? So are there factors which drive agricultural performance? And are there similar or comparable factors that also drive rural poverty? So is the coincidence of rural poverty with agricultural performance in certain regions, namely Sindh and South Punjab, are they both being driven by similar processes? And that's where history will come to help us. So it's going to help us highlight blind spots in politics and policy. We're going to look at land systems. We're going to look at infrastructure development, rural classes and social structures, markets and politics. All of these, you will appreciate, are important in understanding both agricultural growth and agricultural performance, as well as drivers of rural poverty and rural hunger. And then we might be able to see some connections between these two things. We'll focus on the Indus Plains and canal irrigated agriculture. And the main subregions, as I said, are the Indus Plains, Punjab and Sindh, and we can also look at regions within Punjab and Sindh, and the main ones we look at are South Punjab and the rest of Punjab. And the main historical turning points, there are, I think, 4 or 5 that I want to draw your attention to. And these are common ones when we do this kind of historical work on agriculture. 1840s, that's the establishment of colonial rule, and specifically the land settlement. Now, it's already, from a South Asia perspective, it's important to note that the turning point is the 1840s in most of Pakistan. And that's important and significant because South Asia is so huge and so varied, and yet, there's a lot of comparability. Because if I look at the eastern part of South Asia, if I look at Bangladesh, and if I look at Bengal, West Bengal and parts of Bihar, so this stuff was happening perhaps 80 to 90 years before It happened in Punjab and Sindh. And a lot that happened in Punjab and Sindh was an outcome of discussions that were happening and the politics that had happened in colonial rule in the Bengal presidency, in the Madras presidency, in the Bombay presidency. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Then the development of a modern irrigation infrastructure, that's an important turning point for this region, and that's from the 1880s onwards, and in earnest from around the 1900s onwards. But 1880s is an important turning point. Then a very critical turning point in my point of view, and not all studies of agriculture see it that seriously, but there is a lot of interest in this, which is I'm naming it as an event, which is a land alienation law in the 1900 in Punjab, but actually there's a whole politics around that which I want to talk about, and its legacy which remains. And then independence and land reforms, which in Pakistan lasted for about 30 years. And then the Green Revolution, which is common to India and Pakistan, and then later on to Bangladesh also, which is really, we date it back to the 1960s, and different studies talk about a different endpoint, but in Pakistan we're mostly talking about an endpoint because we are now saying that much of the drivers of growth during the Green Revolution have been exhausted. So we are kind of at the end of that, or we're definitely at the end of that. So first, some quick views about property rights in land. So this big turning point in the 1840s. So Punjab gets annexed by the British in 1847. Sindh got invaded in 1853. And so basically, both these important provinces, things were happening. And what you have in a nutshell is a land settlement using models which had been already developed in other parts of India. And the model that was used in Punjab was the Mahalwari, or the village-based land settlement. It was mostly derived from something which had already happened in what were called the Northwest provinces, which is much of central and western UP currently. And it was based on an understanding that central Punjab, which was basically the core political region of the political power from which the British seized control of Punjab, which was the Sikh Empire. Its core region, which consisted of the Lahore division, and then another, I think the Jalandhar division, which is now in Indian Punjab. So this is the core division, and it was basically a peasant caste-dominated village communities, and that it was suited to a model which was village-based. Now, Western Punjab and Southern Punjab, even the British acknowledged that they were quite different from this. But nevertheless, a decision was taken to vest property rights in proprietary village bodies. This is important. So the idea was that you basically vest land revenue liabilities and property rights in a body of village, in a proprietary body of the village, which consists of interconnected families of the same caste, right? So you have these families or groups of families belonging to the same caste, and basically they're now made into a landed class. And this is a model which the British thought existed already in central Punjab, but this is something which they brought into Western Punjab and Southern Punjab, where different kinds of social organization existed. And it elevated the significance of the village as an organizational unit, as a unit of administration, as also as a unit of the economy, and the significance of the formal village record. And who did it dispossess? It basically dispossessed all of those people who had traditional usufruct rights in village, in land resources, in water resources, in common land, but who were not part of the proprietary body. So the village-based settlement, it acknowledged some of them, it recognized some of them, but by and large dispossessed them from land ownership. So that was the Mahalwari in Punjab. While they were doing it, they were already saying that, Southern Punjab and Western Punjab do not conform to this peasant-based village community. And yet we are going to do this model here because we want to inculcate an idea of, village community there. So it's very interesting that they were interested in social engineering of a particular type. And the conditions that they observed in Southern and Western Punjab were actually identical to the ones that they were documenting in Sindh. Now, what is interesting is that Punjab and Sindh were invaded by the British from different directions. So Punjab was invaded from the side of what is currently UP, and Sindh through maritime force from the Bombay Presidency. And Sindh was made part of the Bombay Presidency. In the Bombay Presidency, the dominant method of land settlement was Rayatwari, which was doing settlement directly with cultivators. And when the administrators came, they started looking for a class of cultivators. But actually, they were very confused. And they said that actually we cannot find a class of cultivators. And also villages don't have very long standing. And what they failed to observe was that basically it was a system of shifting cultivation around rivers, similar to what had happened in western and southern Punjab. And that tribes utilized their labor to navigate canals, which were seasonal canals. And through these inundation works, basically much of your cropping agriculture happened. And this is exactly what the system was in Sindh. But the British then vested land rights in the zamindars, basically tribal chiefs who used to preside over this very elaborate system of land and water management. And here who was dispossessed? People who were tenants, people who had been mobilized by the tribal chiefs to work, to excavate canals, and then to work as cultivators, who actually used to get a very big share of the crop, were now basically made landless tenants. So in Sindh and southern Punjab, what happened was that the joint management of land and irrigation was displaced, and a class of rentiers was created, people who were tribal chiefs initially, but now became landlords. And also before they were managing water resources, now they didn't have to manage water resources either. So I'm moving quickly because we don't have much time. And then the next thing which happens is the irrigation systems, large scale canal works, taking water from rivers down to the field, an integrated system with canals linking rivers themselves. And then these replaced local canal systems. And the big thing here was that land was classified, very large tracts of land were classified as uncultivated waste. Whereas before, these were inhabited by pastoral communities, and these were designated as crown property. So in the past, what used to happen was that when tribes managed to mobilize resources to develop land which was adjacent to the land which they were already cultivating was the land on which they had some rights. Now the government said that we are going to do this and we will own this land and we are going to allot it to who we want. And then they started a very big system of migration from the districts of central Punjab to these areas of western and southern Punjab, and then later on to Sindh. People who were formerly canal landlords now became rentiers. And after the land settlement, all they were doing was vying for water resources. So basically a system of productive relationship between different classes was converted to a system where rents became very important, where certain classes were prioritized, and modern technologies came, which certainly led to improvements in agricultural productivity for some time. But nevertheless, they created new systems of rent, which have become very difficult to reform. Now, alongside that, you had a third very important thing that happened, which was a direct consequence of the property rights system regime in land. So just remember that before this, land was not private property, and there was a lot of co-production between cultivators, tribal chiefs, and there are very interesting case studies, historical studies of people who were canal lords, both in Sindh and in Punjab, in western Punjab, in southern Punjab, who would raise capital from merchants underwritten by the state. So the credit relationships were secured. And the state was interested in this because it expanded revenues to them. And now what you had was that being replaced by a system of indebtedness of agriculturalists and a problem of agriculturalists mortgaging land. And then a move by the government to restrict the alienation of land to non-agriculturalists. The government flagged that as a very big problem, a big political problem. Just remember that a lot of this is being motivated by political stability issues, and they have already identified the peasantry, the peasant caste and peasant classes of central Punjab as the backbone of colonial rule. So anything to protect their interests. And then this was escalated as a conflict between urban Hindu merchants often derogatorily labeled as money lenders by the British, actually. So this escalation was actually, you can actually read it in the document. So it's actually, you know, the way that British administrators were taking sides and promoting certain views and promoting certain identities is actually quite spectacular. And setting them up against mostly Muslim, but also Sikh rural peasants. And the government talks up the importance of peasants and the need to protect them. And this happens after a big debate when there are liberals within the British administration who say that, you know, we should allow property rights to play themselves out. And then there are people who say, no, no, we have to protect these peasants because these are the backbone of our political power. And they also try to create some moral arguments against for this. But what it does is, in order to do this administratively, the law begins to define agricultural and non-agricultural tribes. And the collector becomes the highest authority in designating a caste or a tribe as being agricultural and non-agricultural. And this becomes part of the village record, it becomes part of the police record, it becomes part of the legal system. It exists to this date in Pakistani Punjab. I think it has been disposed of in Indian Punjab. And the target were not just merchants, but around a third of the population made up of craftspeople and laborers. So those, you know, when I looked at the 1931 census and the earlier censuses where the caste was identified, you can identify that about a third of the population in Punjab was basically dispossessed from, you know, ownership of land. And then the attitude towards commerce. So the cooperative relationship between state, agriculturalists, and merchants was turned into an antagonistic ones between landowners and moneylenders, with the government intervening on the side of the former. So, you know, I'm saying it all in a nutshell. There's a lot of interesting historical studies on this and interesting debates. But nevertheless, I just want to make this point in a very clear and succinct way that this was a very important turning point in the history of agri-food systems in Punjab and the rest of Pakistan. I probably won't have time to show you all of the stuff, but, you know, you can actually read current policy documents which use virtually the same language that was being used at the turn of the 19th century by British administrators who were actually, some of them were quite unashamed about seeking to, you know, create a conflict between urban Hindus and rural Muslims. Anyway, then the political legacy was inherited and continued in 1947. This idealized agrarian peasant community, which excludes laborers. And I've shown this in the paper that how you can actually see it in the way that the successive population censuses count the population. So in the last census before independence, agricultural laborers were counted. By the time we get to the 1951 census, you can hardly see them even in the census. So the laborers are removed as an important category in agriculture from, you know, discursively, and the agrarian peasant community keeps getting elevated. Then the other colonial legacy of elevating one particular region, which was central Punjab, and other regions being treated as a periphery. So that continued for a while. Some people argue it is still continues to the detriment of the development of agri-food systems and to the detriment of the reduction of hunger and poverty. But nevertheless, that's a different debate. And then caste and class, they are embedded but not recognized. So that again, so that's partially a political legacy inherited from before 1947 and partly a development of political it's like a political development since then. That you know, there is no explicit discussion of caste and no clear discussion of class. You know, with the exception that for some time and for a limited extent, landless tenants were favored for certain benefits. Okay, so in terms of agrarian classes, the crafts people are ignored, the laborers are ignored, but landless peasants, they did get some attention for a little bit of time, but not very much. Commerce, there are hostile attitudes to commerce and a privileged position of landowners. And that creates a very confusing attitude towards markets, which I will talk about a little bit later as well. That, you know, but some of the confusion in terms of policy and in terms of where we need to go, some of it actually comes out of, it's a legacy of narratives and politics which were developed over time. And agri-food systems, well, you would be surprised to note that massive infrastructure development, which is like these canal irrigation projects, you actually don't see hunger and poverty reduction as explicit goals for those. And that kind of carries over that, when you look at agricultural policy in Pakistan, if you even look at the policy with respect to land reforms, you don't see any explicit mention of hunger and poverty, and partly because some of the hungriest and the poorest are actually not part of the solution that is being put forward. Those people are actually laborers, and they're below even the landless peasants. Post-independence trends, land reforms. Better be quick now. So land reforms. So we have a history which lasts for about 30 years. It's mainly limited to redistribution, and basically, my understanding is, and it is shared with many people who have looked at land reforms in Pakistan, is that basically a continuation in some ways of the agenda of the colonial regime, which was to actually create full-fledged private property rights in land. So the first rung of land reforms, basically what it does is that it says that there are landless tenants who should be given property rights in land. So to the extent that we had redistributive land reforms, they were taking some land away from the very big estates and then giving them to landless tenants. So people who are in Punjab already classified as agricultural tribes. So not the most marginalized people. So they wouldn't be the equivalent of scheduled castes, for example. And completely ignores landless tenants. In fact, the discussion in the debates were actually quite interesting. So there's a debate in the 1950s about how they should go about doing land reforms. And the political leadership actually was much more aware of the condition of the landless laborers. So they say that the condition of landless laborers is actually very miserable compared to even landless tenants. So any land reform that we do has to actually look at that very carefully. But when the policymakers, who were then the bureaucrats, when they come to drafting a law, they also discuss this, but they rule it out explicitly, and they say that the conditions of landless laborers are to be dealt with when we look at labor conditions across the board. Well, we're still waiting. I don't think that, I mean, there's no recognition yet of landless laborers as an important category which requires intervention. So land reforms basically will about that. And then redistributive land reforms came to an end in 1977, when it was ruled that, that it was unconstitutional to actually impose land ceilings. So that came to an end. Relatively few people actually got land, but it did lead to some reduction in the size of very large estates. The other important trend was green revolution. And the green revolution, the main innovation here was, I don't have to tell you, most of you know, that is the introduction of fertilizer responsive varieties and the introduction of modern inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. So in Pakistan, it was initially wheat and then rice. The wheat thing happened in Pakistan at around the same time it happened in the western parts of India, in Punjab and Haryana, and then rice comes later. And the main sources of growth are really the introduction of technology, but also interestingly, in Pakistan, alongside the Green Revolution, which was this fertilizer responsive varieties, we were still continuing to have growth through irrigation development. So, so the story which starts in the 1880s, it actually continues for about a good century. So for a good century, Pakistan was continuing to add to its cropped area through the development of irrigation, and then it comes to kind of an end. Now, I think it's very difficult to expand any further. And the main sources, people who have done proper, very careful statistical analysis, and there have been lots of those at different periods in time, is that inputs and not productivity, it's not total factor productivity that was important in wheat. So the main driver for the main crop in Green Revolution is not actually increases in productivity, but increases in the use of better fertilizers and insecticides and better varieties. But in some of the other crops like maize and cotton, we do have improvements in productivity. So that's at least what the statistical analysis shows. And then there is a consensus in academic writing and in policy that at least, at most by the 1990s, the main sources of growth with respect to the Green Revolution had been exhausted. And this kind of picture shows you that a little bit. If you look at cropped area, so even beyond 1947, you see continued increase in cropped area, all the way from about 12 million hectares to about 24 million. So, a doubling of cropped area. And this is gross cropped area. And then a tapering off. So by the time we come to now, we're seeing a kind of a, flattening out. So I just fitted very simply a quadratic, just showing some increase here, but actually, I think this is it. I don't think we're going to see any more sources there. So that basically is the story. Now I'm going to conclude here so that we can have some time for discussion. And I'll conclude by making 4 broad points based on my historical view and also what I draw from history. For now, I'll go back to the initial conundrum or the initial paradox, which I think helps me to see the condition in Pakistan in a more intelligent way, which is that regions which are doing well in terms of yield and in terms of the actual proportion of crops that they contribute, in terms of, there are some other numbers which I didn't show you, but in terms of also adaptability to global markets. So those are basically, South Punjab, the rest of Punjab to some extent, but South Punjab and Sindh. So these regions do quite well in terms of agricultural performance. They do well. So we don't have very many studies that look at competitiveness, in a proper way. But if you look at incidental signs of competitiveness, in the sense that, the produce of these regions, does it go and compete in global markets? Does it rely on subsidies? No, it doesn't. So what's going on? So basically, a lot of these regions that do well are not able to reduce hunger and rural poverty. And so I think that the things I take away from the historical analysis, firstly, is that there are continuing political legacies. So why is that important? So as I showed you, a lot of the policies that were instrumental in shaping agri-food systems in Pakistan, policies around, property rights in land, policies around the property rights in water, policies around the development of irrigation systems, policies around how, attitudes towards markets, all of those. A lot of them date back to the colonial period, and a lot of them date back to a time when certain populations had been identified as being pivotal to the stability of British colonial rule in Punjab and in that part of India, which is Punjab, Sindh, and the rest of Pakistan. So the western part of India, certain populations were seen to be, pivotal for political stability. And a lot of the decisions around these important things, like land systems, irrigation systems, attitude towards markets, and so on, were taken with that. And a lot of those policies continue. Some of them have begun to change, but a lot of those continue. So who was marginalized, who was dispossessed, which regions were important, which regions were not, what kinds of migration were promoted, who was not, who was dissuaded from applying for land allotments and so on. So a lot of those things, they are causes for important disparities within Pakistan now. Regions which received public investments and non-farm employment, again, versus those that didn't, again, important issues. Structure of land ownership, again, continuity within that, again, coming out from there. Second important issue coming out of that is the missing stakeholders. So if you look at current policy debates, peripheral regions, the landless, the laborers are still missing. So there's no discussion of those regions. There's no discussion of the landless and the laborers. And basically, much of the discussion about agricultural policy and agricultural growth is really about more of what we can do using the Green Revolution, while knowing actually that everything that we could have done has been exhausted. So doesn't really provide many new avenues for growth. But nevertheless, these important stakeholders are missing, and I will argue that bringing in these stakeholders will actually open up avenues for a more reasonable discussion about possibilities of growth. Third point, land and water. Now, all the contemporary analyses, both at the policy level and in the academic realm, they talk of major reforms, need for major reforms in governance, both and land use and land water use, irrigation systems. And everyone acknowledges that this is hampered by existing property rights regime and rents. So your rent-seeking classes, which are important, and then there is an entire system of rent-seeking which is extremely well entrenched, and basically none of that allows for important reforms which are required in the use of land and the use of water resources. Fourth important area is competitiveness in markets. So you have, formally speaking, nominally, right? So in terms of literature and in terms of discourse, you have antipathy towards market players. So you still have discussions which go back to the 1900s of how merchants and traders are somehow bad people who are out to exploit hapless farmers. So this whole trope of a simple peasant and a simple farmer being exploited by a cunning merchant. Unfortunately, those tropes still exist, are being written by the same people who are otherwise advocating markets. I'm neither a kind of a markets or a panacea person, nor do I actually think that these kinds of prejudiced views about market players are useful. But nevertheless, I'm constantly surprised at the longevity of this view. And this view being expressed by the very same people who actually would like to see competitive markets. Now, what you actually miss is that farming itself is highly competitive in the sense that farmers are competing in markets where they don't really get much support. And unlike India, we don't have support prices for anything other than wheat. And those support prices are also set in anticipation of world market prices. Apart from sugarcane, actually, there's very little distortion that the government creates through its pricing or other policies. And yet the agriculture sector thrives in the sense that, it is still it's still able to capture markets abroad, much better than, I should say, the manufacturing sector in Pakistan. And a lot of its competitiveness is actually based on its ability to adapt to market conditions and actually, unfortunately, to squeeze labor, right? So a lot of the competitiveness, let's say, of the cotton sector is around squeezing workers who are cotton harvesters. So a lot of the commercial activities in agriculture are successful because of structural issues which go back to the last century or before that. And so we're missing a very important issue with respect to markets and competitiveness if our main focus is really a negative attitudes towards merchants and traders. So we're actually not looking at how farmers are playing the market and how the labor market actually is very skewed against laborers. So I'm going to basically end now so that we have some time for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Haris. I think that was a great summary of the work that we've done so far, centering on that crucial central question, which is on the misalignment between agricultural growth and food security. So, Haris, I think I had a couple of questions, but I think I will go into my questions a bit later. I will take a pick of some of the questions that we've been receiving. So, Dr. Sattar Mandal has asked, so he joined a bit late, so he was wondering if there is any remark about the availability of agricultural labor and wage rates in Pakistan.
Hang on. Any
Potentially the role, I suppose, that it would play in terms of distributing benefits of growth.
Yeah, so see, what's interesting is if you look at, so a good way of understanding where the policy debate is actually to look at policy documents. And I did that. I looked at 5 policy documents, one each for each of the provinces and one for the federal government. And none of them actually has anything meaningful to say about agricultural laborers or wages in agriculture, right? So if you look at the discussion within agriculture, so there's hardly any recognition of agricultural labor and wages. If you look at studies of poverty, you will find it. So if you look at studies of poverty, if you say, okay, what are the correlates of poverty in Pakistan? Who are the people, who are the households which are most likely to be food insecure? So they're going to be people who are working as laborers in agriculture. Another important issue that we have now is that as a lot of men in rural areas are working in non-farm activities. So you have, according to the most recent labor force survey that I looked at, more than half the work in agriculture, more than half the workers in agriculture are now women. And there again, so we're just beginning now with laws to recognize them formally. In one of the provinces, we now have a law which has formal recognition of women agricultural workers as labor. But nevertheless, there isn't that much recognition. So, and that then translates into the way we look at data and we do the analysis.
Right. Okay. There was one from Hirana. It was a little database oriented question. It says that it seems to me that the yield of wheat and rice in terms of ton per hectare is lower than Bangladesh. What is the reason?
I'm not sure what the reason would be. I mean, I can
It could
think.
be agroclimatic. It could be soil based, I suppose. But
It could be soil. Yeah. I mean, it
is
could
there
be
any
soil.
specific nature of the Green Revolution or the way it came that might affect yields in different countries differently?
I mean, what we know in Pakistan now is that I mean, a lot of the studies are showing that the soil is exhausted now. So we actually just need to keep pumping fertilizers to make sure that we can retain the yield. So that's one reason that there has been overuse of fertilizer. There is exhaustion of soil, and I guess that's an important reason. And we do need to rely, as I showed you in one of the earlier slides, that a lot of the reliance is on canal-based irrigation, and we're also basically exhausting water resources. So
Right.
yeah.
So I think Bangladesh being also a more sort of water abundant region compared to Pakistan might be a crucial critical factor there. Okay, we have Dr. Abdul Chima who had some questions.
Thank you very much, Haris Gazdar, for a very insightful presentation. I was just wondering, in this complex array of challenges which we have in Pakistan, water is becoming a new stressor. I mean, it has been becoming a long time, but climate change is, making it more apparent. And we had recently subnational legislation, for example, Punjab Water Act in 2019. I'm aware that Balochistan is also developing a water policy and perhaps a water legislation. Sindh is also, there's also recently been a Sindh water policy. I'm just wondering, do you see water shortages and water policies as an entry point to make the state think of bringing some institutional and structural changes the way agriculture has been operating? And perhaps more, if you can, relate it, just like an excellent insight, that unlike in South where we have more production of wheat and rice, but we have more higher incidence of poverty. So do you think some possibility water shortages and water legislation as an entry point for the state to reconsider its dealing with agriculture and perhaps using it as a way to address hunger and poverty through the means of water? I'm not sure if I'm able to say, pitch it, but that's what I want to.
So what happened? So okay, so I will give you a long-winded answer. Okay, but not I won't take very long, but I will give you a slightly long-winded answer.
Okay.
So I think there is a way of discussing this, and there are many different ways of discussing it, but I want to discuss it using the historical perspective. Now, when you look at history, you find that before the British came, the development of water resources was very closely tied with the development of land resources, and it was done usually in the partnership between many different stakeholders, including government. So I think that if you look at our indigenous systems of water management, so firstly, the indigenous system of land and water management didn't regard any piece of land as free land. It regarded any piece of land as being usable if you were going to invest in it. If you're going to invest labor and resources into it, then you could start using it. And similarly, the indigenous system of water management was connected to how you were going to develop that land. So what kind of resources you're going to put into that. So that created stakes within the rural economy for both land and water. Now that ended, and what we did was we disarticulated everything. We said land, it is either private or government, and water is all government. But the water now, as you know, that canal water is completely now pegged, the ownership rights of canal water are pegged to the ownership rights to land. So, so we have a Varabandi system where your entitlement to water is connected to the amount of land you have in the command area. And so you created a mutually enforcing rentier economy of land and water. And those people, their main interest is to keep increasing their allocations of water rather than a reform of the entire system in which water will be used sustainably. So the problem we have is that if we apply it to historical lens, then the kind of conclusion I come to is that agriculture on its own, agriculture, irrigation, or land, none of them on their own will provide you with the political energy to actually create a reform that is required. So you need a big reform, and you need a reform across these three sectors. And none of these on its own will be able to take you there. Where I do see some avenues for change are exactly what you have pointed out, that, so now we have some discussion at the provincial and sub-regional level of policy on all of these areas. And I think that's really where it is important to create lobbies where we can do some joined up thinking with respect to agri-food systems. So I think we have to bring the agri-food system perspective here and to bring it to the policy table at the provincial level. If the discussion, for example, with respect to South Punjab takes off, I would see that as an important, again, opportunity for discussion of agri-food systems, because the South Punjab agri-food system is quite distinct from that of Central and Northern Punjab. So a lot of the discussion is hampered because, you don't have that level of sub-regional discussion and representation. So I would say that the main openings are really with, sub-national levels of government now.
Right. Thank you, Haris. Dr. Chima, I hope that's a important point for further discussion. But at this point, I just want to, because we are about to close, I just want to take one more question. Okay, there are two more questions. One is, I think this is more of a comment, which is that surface water is still governed by the Irrigation Act of 1873, and recent legislation in Punjab, KP relates to managing groundwater, but not groundwater pricing in Pakistan. I think that relates heavily to the kind of shifts that are happening in terms of irrigation, in terms of groundwater, and that could be a very crucial gap in terms of how maybe agriculture production and distribution is looked at. I'm not sure, Dr. Abdul, if that's a question, but if it's okay, I will take that as a comment and appreciate recognizing that gap for our discussion today. We have one more question from Dr. Satamandal again. If time permits, I would like to know an elaboration on the last conclusion that food policy has negative attitudes to market. Is it market as a whole or some segments like material input market or output market, irrigation water markets, agriculture services or capital markets, etc.?
It's really good question, right? So if you look at policy, so a lot of the policy discussion is informed by people, economists who have trained abroad, and a lot of it is also assisted by organizations like the bank, and I guess elements of the members of the CGIAR. So a lot of those organizations, a lot of those stakeholders have generally a positive attitude towards markets as systems for allocating resources, right? So a lot of that discussion is around the use of markets, market mechanisms. But as soon as it comes to market players, so something happens. So all of these policy documents are very hostile to market players. And they speak of them in the way that the British colonial officers were speaking of them in the 1890s, that somehow, there are these people who are out to get some other people. And I think that, so what we end up doing is then actually not having a responsible discussion about how markets would work, who the market players would be, how, if there are problems with respect to abuse of market power, how are you going to do that? But you have this knee-jerk thing on the one level. You say, okay, markets are a very important institutional mechanism for solving all of those problems. But on the other hand, we have complete mistrust in people who are market players, right? So I think that, that's really, it means that we're not actually looking at this issue sensibly. So we have some kind of a mental or ideological block.
Right. So thank you very much. I hope we've covered all of the questions except mine and Haris. We can do that later when we discuss the work. But I think we have also come close to our the webinar session time. So thank you very much, Haris and everybody else, for joining and engaging with this theme. This thematic area has been for us rather, I think even when we started the work, we were discussing that it's not the traditional research that we always do when we look at, systems and agri-food systems research in our work. So this does take a critical lens, but what I feel that it does permit us is to ask questions of how do we approach policy and impact in a more inclusive manner, and identify and ask ourselves, who do we lose out on or who do we miss out on when we propose recommendations from our scientific research. So with that, I will close. There is I see that, okay. Thanks, Dr. Abdul. Sorry, I thought it was a question. Yes, we will have a study report coming out this year, and maybe follow-up papers if Haris can give me some time this year, next year. I really look forward to that. So thank you very much for joining us today. And Haris, thanks again for taking this session. It was great. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.